Hi, everyone. Welcome to Figuring Out Fabric, where I ask dumb questions and you get smart answers. And this week, I've got Elayne Jones, who's going to help us talk about fabric administration. She has been, you're working for Coca-Cola? Is that what?
Coca-Cola bottler sales and services.
Very
Mouthful.
nice. Yeah. And you've been working with a bunch of different parts of the Power Platform. But from what I recall, you were talking, the talk I saw you at a local SQL Saturday, you were talking about um, Power BI deployment, all that kind of stuff. And it was funny because I went in there kind of, I think there was one point I was like way too cocky. I'm like, oh, deploying by OneDrive, that's so like antiquated. And then there was an actual button where they made it a feature, and I'm like, oh, maybe this is actually a legitimate way of doing it and not just like we're just gonna put it on some file server somewhere. So I think it was a helpful talk. um so so what do you do as a fabric administrator currently? Like, what are your kind of responsibilities?
I'm not currently a fabric administrator, but where I sit on my team, I serve as a expert reference for the Center of Excellence, which is hosted in our IT department. And so they'll come to someone like me and my team as industry experts, and they're looking for guidance into what settings they need to firsthand pay attention to in the admin portal, but on the other hand, like what decisions they might need to make in the admin portal. And I think that kind of like starts off the conversation really well, because I think like just getting an understanding of like who should be an admin in your organization is sometimes not clear, especially when you're looking at documentation. Like some sources will say, oh, your your admins need to be hosted in IT. They need to be separate from the business. They need to understand X, Y, and Z. And I think like you need a bit of like everything when you're looking at who needs to be an administrator. You need to have someone who is technical, who can understand the implications for making some of those selections in the Fabric admin portal. However, I think you do need somebody who is a bit separate from the actual departments and who is possibly a level outside of all those departments. That way they can make decisions that would impact financial considerations, like looking at licensing. They can make decisions that might be outside of one group's specific interest, but might be in the best interest of the entire organization. So I think like just looking at how you're deciding who's going to be an admin in an organization, definitely looking at creating like someone separate outside of any one individual team, but still maintaining contact with all of the departments in your organization and being able to represent each of those department specific needs.
So so talk a little bit more about that. Is the idea that this kind of person is cross-departmental but is still business focused? It sounds like there's someone that's a little bit more outside of IT and they have more of an understanding of the business. Is that accurate? Or like what do you, because like I to me it makes sense, like, okay, people in IT, that makes the most sense a lot of times, but then I can see certain departments needing to be able to manage things or whatever. So can you elaborate more about like kind of this middle role or this hovering sort of role you're talking about?
Mm. I think it really is like you need somebody who's not quite purely business and not quite purely technical. And in our organization, I think they've found the most success with enabling a strategic technical center of excellence who sits within the IT sphere. However, they're more strategic in their decisions. They're really reaching out to the individual departments and understanding their business context. And then they're kind of combining that business knowledge with the technical knowledge that they either have themselves or are consulting with those team leads or IT experts, and making those decisions that kind of combine both realms. Because there are decisions in the admin portal that are outside of pure technical decisions, things looking at like licensing, for example, and
Right.
looking at governing what users have access to what. So it does require somebody with some window and some insight into the business, I believe. And so like having somebody, whether it be like our organization have a specific team that kind of sits between those two spheres, has been really helpful.
That makes sense. I don't know how familiar you are with the Fabric Cat team, but Matthew Roche is on it, and he's talked before about being a PM. And one of the things that was really helpful for me is he talks about how the customer advisory team, the CAT team, sits right in the middle of the problem domain and the solution domain. And I think that over on the IT side, it's very common to over focus on the solution domain, like just really focus on the tech, really focus on a lot of these nitty gritty considerations, and not necessarily have a lot of understanding of the operating of the business. I know that's been kind of my career trajectory where like when I started working in this field, I thought like understanding technology was the most important thing. I couldn't tell you what a credit memo was or a debit memo or that kind of stuff. And then you learn with business intelligence that you actually have to understand the business. And you learn that maybe people like that maybe I unfortunately like looked down upon or didn't respect their talents over time learn like, okay, these are domain experts. And every business, I don't know how much you've had to run into this, but every business, even the same industry, is just this weird, unique snowflake. Like you could take Coca-Cola and Pepsi, and for how they handle invoices is probably going to be completely different, even though you think, okay, they're two main competitors or whatever. And so it really is important to understand some of those particulars for sure. Um, and I think you can probably talk to this, but it is kind of weird the stuff that you can administer. Like you said, it's so at least with the admin panel, you have just all these toggles, just toggles as far as the eye can see. And some of them, like you said, you're dealing with governance or like what can people share and all that kind of stuff. But some of it really is kind of very technical. Like, are we even going to enable these features? Are we going to allow people to create certain types of objects and all that kind of stuff? And it feels a bit clunky. Like, I feel like at some point they're going to have to add some new kind of middle layer because every time they put a preview feature in Fabric, there's a toggle for turning it off temporarily. And eventually, I think a lot of people who are just coming to Fabric, they really wish that they could just disable a whole swath of certain things because it costs a lot of CUs or something like that. So like, what is of what you've been involved with? What has your experience been with kind of like managing all that or the user interface or that kind of stuff?
I think I'm just going to jump the gun. And one of your questions that you prepped me with was, what is your least favorite thing about the Fabric? Just everything. I think how unorganized the entire admin portal has been a huge point of contention, like for me, for people on my team. Just I feel like there's so much in the admin portal that it's
Right.
difficult for people to understand what's important for them at any given time. Additionally, you cannot export the list of settings or
Oh,
export
okay.
any of the information in the admin portal. So it becomes impossible to keep track of uh, what setting has changed at what time, who changed this, what admin, like what AD groups are assigned to what settings, unless you develop some kind of homegrown solution for managing all of that information, which is something that I've done. I've kind of an insane person, honestly. I go overboard with documentation. I just created my own Excel tracker of like all of the tenant settings that are out there, and then when I am in contact with that IT Center of Excellence team and I reach out to them and say, hey, can you enable this setting for this AD group for my solution that I'm creating? I keep track of that in my Excel tracker. That's another thing is sometimes it becomes frustrating whenever you're someone like myself who's a developer sitting outside of that admin role,
Right.
being able to have any sense of visibility into what settings are applied is very frustrating. I think what, just generally speaking, in the admin portal, I've kind of grouped the roles and the responsibilities of an admin into like 4 major areas.
Okay.
And all of the settings, I think, should be grouped into these sections to do kind of like you're saying, give people an easier way to highlight what's exactly useful to them. The 4 that I typically group all of the areas into are auditing what content and what users are out there, monitoring the health of all of that content, so checking whether it is refreshed successfully or not, governing like what users are doing, and then managing your premium resources. So I think like looking at all of the options and features that are available in that admin portal, like through one of those 4 lenses, like, is this something that is going to help me keep track of what my users are doing? Is this something that is going to help me make sure everything is refreshing properly? Is this something that's going to help me allocate cost? I think like looking at everything in the lens of one of those 4 areas is going to really like help, especially new people coming into that admin portal.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting to hear the breakdown because it would be nice if there was more of I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're either just an admin or you're not. And it'd be nice
Yep.
if there was,
Yep.
you could have like 80 roles or fabric roles say, okay, you manage just this kind of piece because there's some of those toggles that, okay, like who cares if you turn it on or off, right? So maybe some um like uh, let's say we enable purview data labels or something, sensitivity labels, like the risk of harm of turning that on, I think is fairly small aside from what you might pay for purview. But there's other stuff like enabling publish to web where, okay, you could, I mean, if you're a regulated company, you could get in a lot of trouble with the SEC or with Sarbanes-Oxley or some other kind of regulation. And I think when I try to talk to people about fabric, whenever I train on it or whatever, there's definitely a real kind of frustration because in terms of enabling or disabling certain fabric features as a whole, it's a global toggle. I mean, certainly you could specify like specific groups or whatever, but it'd be really nice, in my opinion, if not only do they have kind of the split you talk about, but they have this whole feature for domains, for grouping these workspaces. It'd be really nice if we had maybe kind of a domain admin that could say, okay, they can control what kind of objects can be put into the domain, or maybe even some of the basic stuff with capacity, because whether you're doing stuff with production or you're doing stuff with development, that really has a big impact on like how flexible you're willing to be with some of those things.
I think even further, like I used to do training in my previous role as well.
Okay.
Something I did with that Excel tracker was I gave a recommended scope for all of those tenant settings. So even if they don't want to go the granularity of recommending a scope
Yeah.
for each individual setting, just grouping them and saying these would be well reserved for typical basic report creators. However, reserve these settings, something like allowing the XMLA endpoint to connect, like these are for more advanced developers in your organization. Just like giving some kind of guidance of like who each setting might be best suited for and might be safest to enable for would definitely help, I think, a lot of new users as well.
Yeah, it makes sense. And there's always going to be a little bit of a fundamental tension because I think parts of Microsoft wants to have a lot of stuff on by default so people can discover it. But something like publish to web, like I really wish that was off by default kind of thing. But no, that's interesting. So you said there really isn't a good way to like track or import export. So are you going through some API or is this all manual or how are you auditing this stuff?
This is all manual. I'm sure you
Yeah.
could use an API and get at that information more programmatically. However, it does require you to regularly monitor that admin portal and regularly audit the permissions that are being enabled. at any given time. So like which specific groups are allowed for each setting or not. It also requires you to regularly monitor the Fabric releases, as you were saying. Whenever a new feature gets enabled, it just gets added to the admin portal without much notification. So it does require you to actively monitor that information, which I think is partially like one of the things that gets a bit frustrating with the way that the Fabric administration role is that it feels like a lot of things happen without you understanding or being made aware of it unless you're actively seeking out that information. I think
Right. I
just,
mean,
yeah.
that monthly blog post is a long blog
Yep.
post straight through, right?
Yep.
Um, so it can be a bit challenging. So, uh, you've experienced with the Power Platform in general and all that kind of stuff. Do you do you feel like the addition of Fabric has kind of added an additional level of burden with having to think about this kind of stuff, or is it just that they've kind of put it all in one sort of spot? Like, is this like the sum is more than the whole is more than the sum of its parts kind of scenario, or does it just feel that way because they've just put together these like 10 different pieces of software?
I think, at least in my role and in my previous role, even though we're calling it Fabric, it still feels very much focused on the Power BI aspect of everything,
Yeah.
especially the admin portal. Still looks almost exactly the same as when it was the Power BI admin portal. And I feel like most of the settings, most of the things you can do from an administration standpoint still only really focus on the Power BI component of the Fabric ecosystem. And so for me, it feels like even still, like Fabric outside of Power BI capabilities are there and they're available. However, it feels like still the majority of the focus still is on the Power BI aspect of that Fabric ecosystem. So it feels like difficult for me to say, like,
Sure.
like, is everything even like fully baked? Are all the capabilities that are going to be added there right now? It still feels like, yeah, I can go in and create X, Y, and Z artifact outside of Power BI, but really I'm going to be spending most of my time doing Power BI development. Perhaps that is just due to the roles that I've tended to have on the team. However, I still feel like very much that's where the focus is right now.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that it's inherited a lot of things from Power BI. I could easily see it going either way because I think in terms of governance, the amount of mess you could make in a workspace when it was just Power BI, I think was a lot simpler or more manageable. And there was a blog post recently from the Fabric team where they limited the number of objects you can put into a workspace to 1,000 objects. And I'm over here thinking, how did anyone get the number that high? Why did that limit need to be there in the first place? Um, so yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think there is going to need to be some upskilling for a lot of folks, or there's going to have to be more kind of just governance and planning that with Power BI, you could get away with some of that sort of self-service, viral growth kind of stuff. But whenever you're planning out the source of your data and you're doing like these lake houses and stuff, you have to be a bit more thoughtful, or at least it seems like that. Um, so you mentioned that you work with a center of excellence, right? So what's that like? Because that's one of those things that I would watch or read Melissa Coates back when she was working, and she would talk about governance and Power BI, and she would talk about, okay, the importance of a center of excellence, importance of having like a corporate champion. And all my customers are like itty bitty. And so the center of excellence is like the IT person I'm working with, or the person who kind of got field promoted and like, okay, you're in charge of Power BI now. So what has your experience been with like working with the center of excellence? Because I've never had any involvement with one of those before.
I, like you, was very eager when I saw Melissa Coates' article. My eyes shot up. We'll never use that.
Yeah.
But at my previous role, when I did training, a funny anecdote, like I delivered this massive Center of Excellence training. It was a huge proposal. to this organization that was very early in their Power BI stage, even a little bit early in terms of like Excel reporting. So they heard this grand proposal. They said, we need X, Y, and Z. We need people who are experts in everything. We need to have somebody that's their full-time job. And they were terrified. They dropped the proposal. They were like, no, we cannot do that right now. And so when I came to my company now and there was no center of excellence, I was very hesitant before I started recommending any of that kind of thing in my organization. And it's something that happened outside of my role. And it's something that someone was promoted in this IT center of excellence. And he started creating this center of excellence. And my eyes just shot up once again. I was oh, I see somebody's creating this thing that I have always wanted to build up. And so they knew I was familiar with Power BI, and they started reaching out to me about a couple of like things that they felt like they didn't have exactly the knowledge on their team with. So they were looking for somebody with a bit more familiarity in the Power BI technologies to help them create the charter and create the decisions that they would evangelize in the organization. I think like the fact that it's been very early stages has been a bit difficult for my team, because we try to develop a solution. We need to go through X, Y, and Z hurdles with this IT Center of Excellence team because they haven't enabled this for us. However, since they're seeing us as experts in the field, they're very receptive whenever we come with these recommendations and these requests, because I feel like a lot of the time when you hear the term Center of Excellence, you think that's just somebody who's a tower of knowledge. They're unapproachable. They, like they will never listen to my requests. It's fruitless to try to reach out to them. But I think like thinking about the Center of Excellence as a bit more fluid, kind of like we're doing as a conversational piece, we're all just trying to help each other get what we need to do our job right. However, to do it in the appropriate and well-governed manner, I think is a really healthy way to think about a Center of Excellence, especially as these new features are being released constantly. Maybe let's try something, and maybe down the line, that decision no longer works well in our company. Being able to have that flexibility and make those changes, I think is really helpful when it comes to setting up a Center of Excellence.
Now, you mentioned kind of expertise in that kind of stuff. So is there something explicitly that you and your team is expected to do to kind of maintain that expertise? Or does it just come from your role where, okay, you specialize in this, and so therefore you're going to know more? Is there, like, because I met you at a SQL Saturday, so is there any expectation in terms of particular, like, attending trainings or reading books or going to conferences or any of that kind of stuff?
In my organization now, since we are, like, our role in the company, we're expected to be the experts in the area. We don't really have that same, like, stipend or that same expectation for taking certification. That certainly is beneficial and certainly is received well. However, it's not really an expectation. However, I have been at organizations in the past where we did have a certification quota and have like a expectation to be keeping up with our certificate, like our Microsoft certification specifically. So I think like if you're looking to build out that Center of Excellence, it does behoove you to incentivize your employees to get out in the field and get in contact with other people who are doing similar things as you and seeing what they're doing, seeing what works for them, seeing what doesn't work for them. So I think like it is a great idea, absolutely, to incentivize that.
Cool. Anything else you feel like we should have touched on before we wrap up?
I think I'm going to touch on my favorite Fabric feature. It's a small feature, but I really love it. Yeah. It's the folders in the workspaces for exactly what you're talking about.
It's amazing that it took Fabric debugging to get folders in Power BI. Because I delivered a live training a couple weeks ago, and I had to explain to people, like, this is a new feature. And so, in fact, sometimes, like, some of the UI stuff isn't there. There was a period of time where, like, you would make a new notebook, and you couldn't make it inside of a folder or something. I forget what's Fabric artifact. So yeah, I think that's good. I feel like I saw something about tags coming. I forget, but I think having more ways to kind of filter and slice and dice will help quite a lot.
It's a small thing, but it's not a small thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Cool. So we've already talked about your favorite and least favorite Fabric features. Where can people find you? Is there anything you want to promote or anything like that?
I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm also a member of the Data on Rails blog, where
Oh,
I
nice.
post a few blogs with Christina and a couple of others on the team. So those would be
Great.
place. Oh, Christina, she's amazing.
Cool. All right. I'll make sure that we put that in the show notes. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.